March Band, please make your way out the boarding platform, up the ramp, please, bloody red. Still pending the Party of 20, the news wagon, Party of 20.
By the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad. The ET&G would merge with a number of other railroads over time to become the famous Southern Railway in 1894. The Southern would continue to use this 3-mile stretch of track until they abandoned it in the 1950s for reasons I'll explain later in our journey. They built a new line to the north, which you can see to the right of the train now up on that embankment. That line is still used today by the Southern Railway successor, the Norfolk Southern Corporation. Then, of course, after the Southern Railway abandoned this line, they would donate this 3-mile stretch to us here at the museum. Now that steam locomotive you see to the left of our train there, that is the Southern Railway 4501, built in 1911 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it was built for the Southern Railway as a mainline freight locomotive. It is scheduled today to pull our Chickamauga turn, a 6-hour trip that will be leaving at 10 a.m., going to Chickamauga, Georgia, and returning at 4 p.m. If you have a look to the left of the train, you'll see a gravel road. That gravel road down there is the roadbed for the original 1859 right-of-way. The line was elevated to its current height and position in the first decade of the 20th century by the Southern Railway due to numerous occasions of flooding. Chattanooga used to be extremely prone to flooding before the construction of the Chickamauga Dam during the Great Depression. As an example of this flooding on the left, in about another 30 seconds or so, you'll see an opening in the trees. Within that opening will be a sign, and next to the sign will be a tree with a yellow line painted on it. That yellow line represents the high water mark from the Great Flood of 1867. At 9 feet above the track, it will explain why this line had to be elevated. We're now crossing our first bridge over South Chickamauga Creek. In the water below, you may spot some turtles, river otters, or geese. Now to the left in the water, you may see a set of stone piers. Those stone piers mark the site of the original bridge. On top of those stone piers would have been a wooden decking that the rails would have run on. The original bridge in that location was made entirely of stone and was washed away in a flood in 1861. Unfortunately, an engineer did not see that bridge had washed away in time, and, well, let's just say he and his train went for a swim. Across our second bridge over the Western and Atlantic Railroad. That line you'll see below us there is the first line into Chattanooga, being completed by the state of Georgia in 1850. That line runs from Atlanta to Chattanooga and is still owned by the state of Georgia today. They currently lease it out to CSX. That line is also home to a very famous story from the Civil War. Some of you may have heard of it, and that would be the Great Locomotive Chase. For those of you that have not heard of it, the Great Locomotive Chase is the story of Union spy James Andrews and 23 others known as Andrews Raiders. They disguised themselves as civilians and made their way to Big Shanty, Georgia, which is today Kennesaw, Georgia, and stole a locomotive named General while on a fuel, water, and mill stop. They planned to race the General all the way north to Chattanooga, bombarding bridges and destroying track and telegraph wires along the way in an effort to sever the crucial Confederate supply artery. They were pursued by the General's conductor, William Fuller, and a locomotive he commandeered named the Texas. The Texas was facing south, so for the duration of the chase he had to run that locomotive in reverse. The General ran out of fuel just north of Ringgold, Georgia, about 18 miles down the track from Chattanooga. All of the men were caught. 8 of them, including Andrews himself, were unfortunately hung in Atlanta. They are today buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery, around a bronze replica of the General, just a few miles from our current location. The rest of the men either escaped prison or were exchanged for Confederate prisoners. Andrews' Raiders were the very first to ever receive the Medal of Honor, but Andrews himself did not, as he was a civilian and not eligible. If you'd like to know more on the topic, there are many books and films based on the event, including Buster Keaton's silent film The General.
Ready, it's going to start turning.
Alright everyone, welcome to East Chattanooga. As you can see here, we have reached the end of the line. So we're going to pull the locomotive onto this turntable and spin it around for the return trip to Grand Junction. This table you're looking at here was constructed in 1916 by the American Bridge Company and was used by the Central of Georgia Railroad in Macon, Georgia at the Roundhouse. That is up until 1925 when they sold it to a branch line based out of Seaton, Georgia. And that branch line used it in a very similar fashion to how we're using it here today. This table, we acquired it in the 80s, moved to this location, and we've been using it ever since. The table is 80 feet long, and it weighs in at 80 tons. Keep in mind, the average school bus only weighs about 6 or 7 tons. That locomotive there weighs in at 115 tons. So what it is on the table here, the overall weight between the two is going to be sitting very close to 200 tons. So it may surprise you to know that this table was originally table around. Do we have any volunteers? We're going to need 4. We got 1, 2, 3, 1 more, 4. Come on over. Yeah, I'm just kidding. I got you. No, we don't do it that way anymore today. We just use a small 25 horsepower motor under the operator's shed here that our conductor Dave will be operating. Now keep in mind that when they were turning these tables by hand in the early 20th century, they were turning steam locomotives, not diesel locomotives. Those on average weigh a little over 200 pounds. Now if they were turning this table by hand and even though they were today, we have weighing the table down. You'll see it drop about it. And that drop Electromotive Division, or E&D, for the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, which is more famously known as the Milwaukee Road. This locomotive is classified as an SW1200, the SW meaning switching. It was designed for switching service in the freight yard, moving the cars around, and the 1200 meaning that 12-cylinder engine produces 1200 horsepower. We acquired it in 2015 from the United States Navy, who owned it at the time, and we got it to Chattanooga and restored it back to operation. Now, as we spin around, take a look up in the front of the cab here, and you'll be able to see our engineer, Tyler. He is responsible for operating the locomotive and getting us here and back safely today. So when you can see him, go ahead and give him a wave.
Now, while these are commonly referred to as diesel locomotives, the correct term for these engines is actually diesel-electric, meaning inside this engine there's a large diesel motor turning a generator. That generator produces electricity, and that electricity is fed down to the traction motors that sit on each axle of this locomotive. And it's those traction motors that are actually propelling the locomotive, hence the term diesel-electric. Diesel locomotives have always been made that way, and that's the way they're still made today. Whether it's Norfolk Southern, CSX, or Union Pacific, those are all diesel electrics. The major difference between the early diesel locomotives and the ones being produced today is that today's modern engines have computer systems in them, as well as produce much more power and are much more fuel efficient. Now, the reason these diesel locomotives would go on to replace the steam locomotives was for one reason, and that was money. The steam locomotives were much more expensive to operate all around. For example, those steam engines spent much more time down for maintenance and repairs. They also had to spend a lot of money on lubricants for those locomotives because of all the exterior moving parts. As well as the crew members, steam locomotives have to have 2 crew members, while diesel locomotives only need 1, so that's more cost for the staff. And then last, of course, is the fuel. The fuel on a steam locomotive is more expensive than diesel fuel. Now, a common misconception is that power was a reason. That is actually not the case. Power is not a reason that the steam locomotives are replaced. In fact, most steam locomotives of the day were much more powerful than their diesel locomotive counterparts. Keep going. That's it. As a great example, as I mentioned a moment ago, this locomotive built in 1954 only produces 1,200 horsepower. The last steam locomotive you saw at Grand Junction, the 4501, it was built in 1911 and it produces 2,500 horsepower. Diesel locomotives did not reach the 2,500 horsepower mark until about the mid-70s. Now, as you can see, we've lined the locomotive up with track 2, even though our train currently sits on track 1. That is so we can do a runaround. What that means is the locomotive is going to go past our train and then through a switch. We'll then reverse through the switch back into track 1 and go to the other end of the track, so we'll different direction.